This is the fourth lecture from chapter 17, and I ended the last lecture talking about the energy pyramid, where we have this inefficient transfer of energy from one level to the next in a food chain. And what I wanted to pick up with was just looking at this again and looking at a problem related to this. So again, you lose 90% of the biomass when you go from one step of the food chain to the next. And I just wanted to point out, you may see this sometime called a trophic level. So each of these is a trophic level, an eating level, if you want to think of it that way. And so you lose that 10%, or only 10% goes to the next level, and so on up. So let's think about this. If we apply this 10% rule, how much plant biomass will we need in order to produce a 1,200 pound cow? So we've got, if we are going from plants, so grass, to cow, I'm not going to try and draw one. I know you guys would greatly enjoy watching me draw a cow again. So cow, so plants to cow. We want the cow to be 1,200 pounds, so we need to know how much plant we need to feed it. Well, if we only get 10% going up to the cow, that means that we need to move the decimal point, all right? So we're going to need 12,000 pounds of plant biomass, 12,000 pounds of plant to feed the cow to be able to get that 1,200 pounds, because this would be 10% of this, okay? Because we just move the decimal point over one. So what does this matter? Why do we care? This is actually one of the reasons why people are talking about using or going to vegetarianism, having people eat more plants, because we can feed a lot more people on plants than we could cows. Because let's think of it, instead of in pounds, let's think of this as far as numbers, okay? So if we had, let's just use 1,000, okay? So let's say we had 1,000 plants. That would feed only 100 cows, and that would only feed 10 humans, okay? But if we don't feed the plants to the cows, in theory, we could actually instead feed those plants straight to humans and feed 100 humans instead. So we could feed more people if we eat plants rather than if we eat meat. So that's the 10% rule in application. The next section is looking at chemicals. So we've looked at energy and how energy moves through an ecosystem. Now we're going to look at chemicals and how chemicals move through ecosystems. And chemicals do something different. So energy flows, chemicals cycle. So they recycle through the ecosystem. So energy is one way, chemicals go round and round. So we're going to be looking at 3 different chemicals. We're going to look at carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Now, no matter what chemical we're looking at out of these 3, they do have things in common. So we're going to take a look at the common pattern first. So the first thing is a chemical reservoir. Each chemical has a chemical reservoir, meaning that they are stored in a non-living part of the environment. So they're stored in an abiotic part of the environment. So that could be water, it could be air, soil, rock, and so on. So any non-living part of the environment is a possible chemical reservoir. So the general pattern is going to be the same for each of these chemicals that we're going to look at, because the chemical is going to be stored in that non-living part of the environment. Organisms are going to acquire the chemical from the reservoir. The way it happens is going to be different, but somehow they're going to get that chemical from the reservoir. The chemical will cycle through the food chain, so it's going to move through the food chain, and eventually the chemical will be returned to the reservoir. So this is the big pattern that all three of these are going to undergo. So the chemical is in the non-living part of the environment, that reservoir. The organisms are going to pull the chemical from the reservoir. The chemical will cycle through the food chain, and then eventually the chemical is going to be returned to the reservoir. What we're going to see is there are going to be big differences here, where how the chemical is going to be removed from the reservoir, and there's going to be some big differences here, meaning how the chemical gets from the food chain back to the reservoir. And we'll see some differences here, meaning where the chemical is as far as the reservoir. All right, so we're going to start first with the carbon cycle. Now, if you look in your book, these are all filled out, but we're going to walk through the carbon cycle with just the picture. So we're going to start with the reservoir. So find the reservoir and figure out where the carbon's starting. And they've actually labeled it for us right here. So for land-based organisms, the most important reservoir is the atmosphere. So our atmosphere is going to be our reservoir. And so we're going to start right here. So we're going to start with our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So that's where we're going to be. So we're going to follow where it goes from there. So if you look, it is going to come out of the reservoir and get pulled into where? It's going to get pulled into a plant. So how is it going to get pulled into that plant? That's right, through photosynthesis. So you guys know that plants are going to use carbon dioxide through photosynthesis. I'm going to just shorthand this. So photosynthesis, carbon dioxide, CO2 is going to be used in photosynthesis by the plants. That's how it's going to get pulled out of the reservoir. Then the next part, it's going to move through the food chain. So it's going to move through the food chain. Now you'll see that there is a number 2 right here. Number 2 is the chemical actually being returned to the reservoir. So here it's moving through the food chain, but at the same time it's going to be returned to the reservoir. And you guys actually are familiar with the process of how it's going to get returned to the reservoir. So plants pulled it out via photosynthesis. So what's the opposite of photosynthesis? That's right, cellular respiration. So as plants and animals do cellular respiration, they're going to release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Right? So that's the big part of the cycle right there. But there are a few other things that can happen. So number 3, this is what I call D&D. Basically, organisms die and defecate. The big one is death. So these organisms die, and in the case of carbon, if they die in the right location, they can turn into oil or coal or natural gas. And you may have heard of those guys before, referred to as fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, these are basically just decayed plants and animals, hence the fossil part. So fossil fuels can get formed by burying plants and animals, burying their carbon, and they get transformed. The reason why these two are here is because this is how humans can alter the cycle. Because what we do, nature locked this away. What we do is number 4. So number 4, we dig up the carbon, in the form of coal, natural gas, oil, and we burn it. When we burn that fuel, we release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Okay? And so this is why our global CO2 levels are rising. It's these fossil fuels. As we burn the fossil fuels that were locked away millions of years ago, those carbon dioxide molecules that were locked away with them are going to get put back into the atmosphere and increase our CO2 levels. I'm going to stop here, and in our next lecture I will pick up with the other 2 chemicals that we're going to talk about for the cycle, nitrogen and phosphorus.